Newspaper Audio presents The Scandal in Kissing an Heir at the Kingsborough Ball by Sophie Barnes. Performed by Susan Duerden. Chapter 1. Kingsborough Hall, Moxley, England, 1817. Daniel Neville, heir to the Marquess of Wolvington, removed himself to a corner of the Kingsborough ballroom, as good a place as any for a man who'd been labelled an outcast by society. Overhead, candles held by 3 large chandeliers spread their glow across the room, the jewels worn by countless women winking in response to the light. This was true opulence, and nobody did it better than the Kingsboroughs. Why, there was even a glass slipper sculpted from ice and a pumpkin carriage sitting outside on the lawn, a touch of fairy-tale splendour indicative of the theme that the Dowager Duchess had selected for her masquerade. And what a masquerade! Never in his life had Daniel borne witness to so many feathers. They were everywhere, attached to gowns, on the edges of masks, and sprouting from women's hair. The ball gowns were marvellous too. These were not the boring dresses generally on display at Almack's. Certainly, one could still tell the débutantes apart, due to their tepid choice of colour, but they all had a bit of something extra, like crystal beads that sparkled when they moved. It was refreshing to see, and yet, as he stood there, watching the spectacle unfold, Daniel felt nothing but bland disinterest. It was only 1 hour since he'd arrived, but it felt more like 4. God help him, but he'd never been so bored in his life. Perhaps he should have remained in London after all. At least there he had his friends to keep him company, and could avoid the constant reminder of how unwelcome he was among the finer set. His aunt and uncle were in attendance, of course, but as soon as they'd entered the ballroom, they'd been approached by Lady Dearford. Daniel had hastily slipped away in order to avoid the Countess, who had a renowned tendency to talk the ear off anyone willing to listen. In hindsight, he was beginning to think that nodding his head in response to whatever she had to say would have been preferable to this self-imposed solitude. Recalling the glass of champagne in his hand, he took another sip of his drink, and decided to request a brandy from one of the footmen at the first available opportunity. Stronger stuff would be required if he was to get through the rest of this evening. He watched as a group of ladies approached on their tour of the periphery. There were 3 of them, one being the Countess of Frompton. If Daniel wasn't mistaken, the 2 young ladies in her company were her granddaughters. Typical débutantes dressed in gowns so pale it was hard to discern where the fabric ended and their skin began. It would do them both a great deal of good to get married, if for no other reason than to be able to add a touch of colour to their attire. As they came nearer, Lady Frompton glanced in Daniel's direction. Their eyes met briefly. Then her ladyship quickly drew her granddaughters closer to her, circumventing Daniel in a wide arc that would have been insulting had it not been so expected. They weren't the first to avoid him that evening. Indeed, the 3 youngest Rockley sisters had beaten a hasty retreat a short while earlier, when they'd realised who they'd been heading toward on their own tour of the ballroom. Daniel hadn't been surprised, for his reputation was so tarnished that he could probably ruin a lady by merely glancing in her direction. Why he'd bothered to attend the ball at all, when the chance of enjoying himself had been as distant a prospect as traipsing through the African jungle, was beyond him. Well, not entirely. He needed to find himself a wife, or so his uncle had informed him last week, when he'd discovered that Daniel had hosted a most outrageous party at his bachelor lodgings. An event that had been sponsored indirectly by his uncle via Daniel's monthly allowance, where 21 had been played until most of the courtesans and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?